There is a moment just before sunrise when the desert and the river seem to hold their breath together. The sand is still cool from the night. The water is still dark, more black than blue, moving south to north in a direction that always seemed, to the earliest people who watched it, faintly impossible. Rivers were supposed to run away from mountains toward the sea, carrying the mountain's coldness down into warmer lands. But here, deep in the heart of northeastern Africa, the Great River did something else. It rose in highlands far to the south, in places no one along its lower banks would ever see, and it travelled thousands of miles through stone and marsh and cataract, and then, every single year, without fail, for reasons no one living beside it could explain, it swelled beyond its banks and covered the land in dark, rich mud. They did not know where the flood began. They did not know why it came in summer, when the sky above them stayed cloudless and merciless and the sun pressed down like a weight. They only knew that it came, and that when it receded, it left behind something better than what it had covered. It left behind soil so fertile that a single handful could feed the imagination of an entire civilization for 3,000 years. This is where the story begins, not with a king, not with a pyramid, not with a curse or a treasure or a tomb sealed in silence. It begins with a river that broke every rule a river was supposed to follow, and with the people who decided, generation after generation, that a land shaped by such a mystery must be a land watched over by something greater than themselves. Tonight we are going to walk beside that river, slowly, patiently. We will move through the villages before there were kings, through the fields before there were pyramids, through the quiet hours of ordinary lives lived beneath a sky the ancient Egyptians believed was a second river, flowing above their heads, carrying the sun in a boat from one horizon to the other. You do not need to remember every name. You do not need to hold on to every date. Let them pass through you the way the flood passed over the land, leaving something behind, without asking you to hold on to the water itself. Close your eyes if you like. The story will still be there. To understand Egypt, you first have to understand a peculiar kind of geography, one that shaped nearly everything the Egyptians believed about order, chaos, life and death, long before any of those ideas were written down. Picture a long, narrow ribbon of green, sometimes only a few miles wide, cutting through an ocean of sand that stretches, in places, for 1,000 miles in every direction. This ribbon is the Nile Valley. On either side of it, the land rises into pale limestone cliffs, and beyond those cliffs there is almost nothing. No rivers, no lakes, no permanent settlements, just wine-carved stone and shifting dunes that the ancient Egyptians called Deshret, the Red Land. The valley itself, dark with silt and abundant with barley and flax and papyrus, they called Kemet, the Black Land. 2 words, 2 colours. 2 worlds, lying side by side, close enough to walk between in a single afternoon. This division was not merely geographic. It became a way of understanding existence itself. The Black Land was life, predictable, fertile, watched over by gods who could be reasoned with through ritual and offering. The Red Land was death, danger, the realm of foreign enemies and desert demons, a place where the ordered universe frayed at the edges. A farmer standing at the boundary between them, 1 foot in green barley and 1 foot in pale sand, was standing at the boundary between everything his civilization understood as good and everything it feared. The Nile itself was not one river behaving the same way everywhere. In the south, near the first cataract, a stretch of rocky rapids close to modern Aswan, the river moved fast and loud over black granite boulders, and the land beyond it was already Nubia, a different culture, a different language, though close ties of trade and, eventually, conquest would bind the 2 regions together for millennia. Moving north, the river slowed, widened, grew gentle enough for reed boats to drift lazily downstream on the current alone, needing only a sail to travel back south again against the flow, pushed by winds that blew, conveniently, in the opposite direction of the water. It was a strange kind of grace, this river. You could go south by wind and north by current, and the Egyptians noticed this so precisely that their hieroglyph for travel southward showed a boat with a sail raised, and their hieroglyph for travel northward showed a boat with the sail lowered, oars in the water. Near the very end of its journey, before reaching the Mediterranean Sea, the river split into multiple branches and spread into a wide, marshy fan of land called the Delta, dense with papyrus thickets, waterfowl and fish. Ancient Egyptians pictured their entire country in this shape, a long stem representing the valley, and a blossoming triangle at the top representing the delta. which is part of why the papyrus plant and the lotus flower became such enduring symbols in their art. They were not simply decorative, they were a portrait of the land itself. And then there was the flood. Every year, beginning in June, the river began to rise. By late summer it would crest, sometimes overflowing its banks by several feet, submerging the fields entirely, turning the valley into what one visiting Greek writer, centuries later, would describe as a temporary sea, with villages sitting like islands upon low mounds, connected to each other only by boat. The floodwaters carried with them fine black silt, washed down over thousands of miles from the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, and when the waters finally withdrew in autumn, that silt remained, spread evenly across the land like a gift laid out on a table. They called this flood the inundation, and they attributed it to the tears of a goddess, or the sweat of a god, or the overflowing of a great cosmic ocean that surrounded and underlay the whole of creation. They built their calendar around it. The year divided into 3 seasons, not 4. Akhet, the season of the flood. Peret, the season of growing, when the water receded and seeds went into the soft black earth. And Shemu, the season of harvest and low water, when the heat grew fierce and the river shrank back into its narrow channel, waiting to rise again. If you had been born a farmer in this world 5,000 years ago, your entire sense of time, your sense of past and future, of safety and danger, of gratitude and worry, would have been governed by that single immense rhythm. A good flood, high enough to reach the fields but not so high it destroyed the villages, meant abundance. A weak flood, one that failed to rise properly, meant hunger sometimes for an entire year, sometimes longer. This vulnerability, this dependence on something so far beyond human control, is in many ways the seed from which the entire religious and political structure of ancient Egypt eventually grew. If the flood could not be controlled, perhaps it could be pleased. And if it could be pleased, someone needed to know how. Long before there were pharaohs, before there was writing, before the first stone was cut for any monument, there were villages. Archaeologists have found their traces scattered along the Nile's banks, dating back 7, 8, even 9,000 years, small clusters of mudbrick and reed huts, grain storage pits dug into the earth, the bones of cattle and goats, fragments of pottery decorated with simple painted lines representing boats, animals, the flood itself. These were not the Egypt of gold masks and towering statues. They were farming communities, not unlike farming communities anywhere else in the ancient world, except for one thing. The land they farmed was almost absurdly generous, and that generosity gave them time. Time to develop pottery styles distinct from their neighbours. Time to trade with communities upriver and down, exchanging obsidian, shell ornaments, copper. Time to bury their dead with increasing care. And it is in these burials that we begin to see the earliest hints of the beliefs that would eventually shape one of the most sophisticated afterlife traditions the ancient world ever produced. Picture a village along the Nile around 1,500 years before our own time. Mudbrick homes, low and rectangular, clustered close together to save the scarce fertile land for crops rather than housing. Roofs made of palm fronds layered over wooden beams, providing shade against a sun that by midday made the air above the sand shimmer and bend. Courtyards shared between families, where bread was baked in simple clay ovens, where children ground grain between stones under the watchful eye of grandmothers, where chickens, no, not yet chickens, those would arrive later from further east, but ducks and geese wandered underfoot. The Nile provided fish in astonishing quantity, caught with nets woven from flax or speared with simple harpoons from small reed boats. It provided waterfowl, hunted in the marshes with throwing sticks, a skill so central to elite identity that thousands of years later, wealthy Egyptians would still be painted on tomb walls hunting birds in the marshes, even if they had never actually done so themselves, because the image had become a symbol of vitality and control over the natural world, rather than a literal record of daily activity. Barley and emmer wheat grew in the fields once the floodwaters withdrew, planted by hand, the seed pressed into the mud, sometimes simply by driving herds of sheep or pigs across the fields to trample it in. Flax provided linen, the fabric that would clothe nearly every class of Egyptian society for the next 3,000 years, worn garments so light and finely woven that some surviving examples are almost transparent, a practical necessity in a climate where heavy fabric would have been unbearable for most of the year. Beer, thick, nutritious, only mildly alcoholic, made from fermented bread and grain, was consumed by everyone, from the poorest farmer to eventually the king himself, alongside bread, in a diet that some historians describe as remarkably stable and sufficient for its time, so long as the flood cooperated. There was no writing yet in these early villages, no kings, no armies, no monuments, but there was already something recognizably Egyptian forming, a comfort with the rhythm of the river, a sense that the world was fundamentally orderly, provided one respected its patterns, and a growing suspicion, evident in the increasing care given to burials, that death was not necessarily an ending. Some of the earliest burials found in Egypt show bodies placed in a curled fetal position, facing west, toward the setting sun, toward the direction the sun seemed to travel into and disappear each evening. Grave goods were included even at this early stage. Pottery vessels, presumably for food and drink, simple jewelry, sometimes tools. This was not yet the elaborate theology of judgment and eternal life that would define later Egyptian religion, but the instinct behind it, that a person continued to need things after dying, that death was a transition rather than an erasure, was already present quietly, in the way these long-forgotten farmers laid their dead to rest facing the horizon where the sun vanished each night, trusting, perhaps, that it always returned. Slowly, over centuries, these scattered villages began to organize into larger units. Historians and archaeologists refer to this as the process of state formation, but that phrase does no justice to what it must have actually felt like. The accumulation, generation after generation, of small decisions about who would lead a harvest festival, who would arbitrate a dispute over grazing land, who would organize labor when a canal needed clearing after the flood. By around 100 BCE, and here we should pause on something important. Nearly every date in this earliest period of Egyptian history is an approximation, pieced together from later king lists, pottery styles and radiocarbon dating, and scholars continue to debate the details even now. By around this time, two loose confederations had emerged along the Nile. In the south, along the narrower stretch of the valley, a kingdom historians call Upper Egypt had formed, its symbol the white crown and the sedge plant, its protective goddess a vulture named Nekhbet. In the north, across the wide fan of the delta, a kingdom called Lower Egypt had formed, its symbol the red crown and the papyrus plant, its protective goddess a cobra named Wadjet. Notice, if you like, the reversal already present in Egyptian geography. Upper Egypt lies to the south, because the land rises in elevation as the river flows north toward the sea. So the Egyptians oriented their entire sense of up and down according to the flow of water, not according to a map as we might draw one today. When you hold this reversal in your mind, something interesting happens. You begin to see the world, briefly, through Egyptian eyes, where south is up, north is down, and the sun sails a boat across the sky each day before descending into darkness each night, only to be reborn again at dawn. Tradition holds that a king, later Egyptian sources call him Menes, though modern scholars often connect this figure to a ruler named Narmer, known from an extraordinary carved stone artifact called the Narmer palette, united these two kingdoms into a single state for the first time. The Narmer palette itself, found at the ancient site of Heracompolis, and now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, shows a king wearing the white crown of the south on one side, striking down an enemy with a mace, and on the reverse, the same king wearing the red crown of the north inspecting the bodies of defeated foes. Whether this depicts an actual singular conquest or symbolizes a longer, messier process of political consolidation, compressed into a single ceremonial image, historians still debate. What is clear is that the Egyptians themselves, for the next 3,000 years, remembered this unification as the foundational moment of their civilization, so central to their identity that every king who followed, for millennia afterward, carried the title Lord of the Two Lands, and wore, on ceremonial occasions, a combined crown that fused the white and red crowns into one, a small daily reminder, worn upon the head of the most powerful person in the kingdom, that Egypt's entire existence rested on the ongoing, fragile unity of two very different halves. This idea, unity as a fragile, maintained state rather than a permanent guarantee, would prove to be one of the most important undercurrents running beneath the entire span of ancient Egyptian history. Egypt would fracture and reunite more than once over the following 3,000 years, and each time it did, the reunification was remembered, celebrated, and mythologized precisely because unity was never something the Egyptians took for granted. It was something achieved, something maintained through ritual, through the presence of a legitimate king, through the correct performance of the god's demands. Which brings us gently to a concept that sat at the very center of Egyptian civilization for its entire span: Ma'at. Ma'at is often translated simply as truth or justice, but neither word fully captures it. Ma'at was order itself, cosmic, social, and personal order, all understood as a single unified principle. It was the correct functioning of the universe, the sun rising each morning, the flood arriving each summer, the stars moving in their expected patterns, a king ruling justly, a judge ruling fairly, a son honouring his parents, a farmer paying his fair share of grain to the state granaries. All of these were expressions of the same underlying force. And its opposite, Isfet, chaos, disorder, falsehood, was not simply an abstract danger. It was a real and constant threat, always pressing at the edges of the ordered world, the way the desert pressed at the edges of the fertile valley. The king's central role in Egyptian belief was to maintain Ma'at. This is why Egyptian kingship developed into something quite different from kingship in many other ancient societies. The Egyptian king, later called Pharaoh, though that term, meaning roughly great house, actually originated as a reference to the royal palace, and only came to refer to the king himself many centuries into Egyptian history, was not simply a political ruler. He was understood as a living link between the human world and the divine world, the earthly incarnation of the god Horus, and, after death, associated with Osiris, the god of resurrection. His daily rituals, performed in temples across the country, though most people would never witness them directly, were believed to sustain the sun's journey across the sky, to keep the flood coming, to keep chaos at bay. It is worth sitting with how strange, and how logical, this idea would have felt to someone actually living it. Imagine growing up entirely within a landscape defined by one overwhelming, unpredictable, life-giving force, the flood, and slowly coming to believe that this force could be, in some sense, negotiated with, so long as the right person performed the right rituals in the right way at the right time. The king was not simply a powerful man who happened to also perform religious duties. In the Egyptian worldview, the king's religious function and his political function were the same function, expressed in different registers. A weak, illegitimate, or impious king was not simply a bad administrator. He was a threat to the fundamental order of existence itself, someone whose failures might genuinely cause the sun to falter or the river to fail. This belief gave Egyptian kingship a stability that few other ancient political systems achieved. For most of Egyptian history, the question was never whether there should be a king. That was as unquestioned as whether there should be a son. The question was only which particular family, which particular individual, held that role at a given moment. This is part of why Egyptian civilization endured, essentially continuously, along the same river, worshipping largely the same gods, using largely the same writing system, for roughly 3,000 years. A span of time so long that the pyramids of Giza were already more than 1,000 years old, already ancient monuments from a half-remembered past. By the time Cleopatra, the last of Egypt's Greek-descended pharaohs, was born, let that settle for a moment. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the invention of the smartphone than she did to the construction of the Great Pyramid. Egyptian history is not a single story unfolding at a single pace. It is closer to an ocean, vast, deep, containing multiple currents moving at different speeds, some periods of rapid change compressed against other periods that stretched on, placid and largely unchanging, for centuries at a time. But we are getting ahead of the river. Let us return instead to the texture of daily life in early dynastic Egypt, the period following unification roughly 5,000 years ago, when the idea of a single Egyptian state was still new enough to require careful tending, and the monuments we now associate most strongly with Egyptian civilization had not yet been imagined. If you had walked through a town along the Nile in this period, the first thing you likely would have noticed is how completely the rhythm of the river dictated the shape of the day, the season, and the year. Homes were built from mudbrick, a material made simply from Nile mud mixed with straw, shaped in wooden molds, and left to dry in the sun, a technology so effective and so perfectly suited to the local climate that Egyptian villages continued using it, essentially unchanged, for thousands of years, and in some parts of Egypt today, families still build with mudbrick in much the same way. A typical home for a farming family would have been modest, a few rooms arranged around a small central courtyard, walls thick enough to keep interiors cool during the punishing heat of midday, small high windows to allow air circulation while limiting direct sun. The roof, often flat, served as an additional living space, a place to sleep on especially hot nights, to dry grain, to store household goods. Furniture for most families was minimal. Low stools, woven mats for sleeping, storage cats and pottery jars for grain, oil, beer and water. Wealth, even at this early stage, showed itself in subtle differences. A slightly larger home, an extra storage room, imported goods like fine stone vessels or copper tools, rather than in obvious displays of luxury that would only become common much later among the elite of subsequent dynasties. The workday for most Egyptians began early, before the sun climbed too high, and paused during the hottest hours of the afternoon, resuming again as the heat softened toward evening, a pattern that again has persisted in parts of rural Egypt into the modern era. Men typically worked the fields, tended livestock, fished or practiced crafts. Women managed households, ground grain, wove linen, brewed beer, and, especially among poorer families, also worked alongside men in the fields during planting and harvest seasons. Children helped from a young age, minding geese, fetching water, gleaning leftover grain after harvest. Though childhood, for those families who could afford it, also involved simple toys that archaeologists have recovered in surprising abundance. Wooden animals with movable legs, dolls, small clay balls, board games played with carved pieces on grids scratched into stone or painted onto wood. One of the most beloved games, called Senet, appears in Egyptian art and archaeology from this early period onward, played on a board of 30 squares, its exact rules lost to time and reconstructed only through educated guesswork, though its popularity is unmistakable. Senet boards have been found in homes of every social class, and, centuries later, in the tombs of kings, buried alongside them as though a good game might still be welcome in whatever came next. Food, for most people, centered on bread and beer, supplemented with vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, beans, lentils, along with fish from the river and, on special occasions or among wealthier families, meat from cattle, goats, sheep or fowl. Dates, figs, and later, grapes provided sweetness. Honey was prized and relatively rare, reserved mostly for those who could afford it or for religious offerings. Cooking took place largely outdoors, or in open courtyards, over simple hearths, in pottery vessels that archaeologists have found in enormous quantities at nearly every excavated settlement, their shapes and decorations offering some of our clearest evidence for how ordinary Egyptian life actually looked, smelled, and tasted, long before any pharaoh's name was carved into stone. Clothing was simple and practical, suited to the heat. Linen kilts for men, linen dresses or wraps for women, often left plain among common people, though even modest households valued cleanliness and personal grooming to a degree that surprised later Greek and Roman visitors, who commented on Egyptian habits of frequent bathing and careful attention to hygiene. Wigs, cosmetics and jewellery, even simple jewellery made from shell, bone or coloured stone rather than gold, appear across social classes from very early in Egyptian history, suggesting that personal adornment was never solely the privilege of the elite, even if the materials available differed enormously between a farmer's household and a noble's. Religion, too, saturated ordinary life in ways that went far beyond grand temple rituals performed by priests on behalf of the king. Households kept small shrines, protective amulets were worn by adults and children alike, and certain gods were especially beloved by common people precisely because they addressed everyday concerns rather than cosmic order. Bez, a dwarf god with a fierce, almost comical lion's face, protected households, women in childbirth, and young children from harm. Taret, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, offered similar protection during pregnancy and birth, a time of genuine danger in the ancient world, when maternal and infant mortality remained tragically high despite whatever comfort religious practice could offer. It is easy when we speak of ancient Egypt to leap immediately to kings and pyramids and golden masks, because these are the things that survived most dramatically, the things museums display and documentaries linger on. But it is worth remembering, gently, before we return to the story of kings, that the overwhelming majority of people who ever lived in ancient Egypt never saw a pyramid being built, never entered a royal tomb, never laid eyes on a pharaoh, except perhaps from a great distance during a rare public procession. They lived instead in this quieter world, of mudbrick homes and courtyard hearths, of sonnet games played by lamplight, of small household gods asked to watch over a sleeping child, of bread and beer and the endless, patient rhythm of a river that rose and fell, across every single year of every single life. And yet the kings mattered too, not only to themselves, but to the very people whose lives seem, from this distance, so separate from royal concerns. Because it was the king's presumed relationship with the divine order that allowed the state to organize labor, collect grain for lean years, coordinate irrigation projects that no single village could manage alone, and eventually undertake constructions so immense that they remain, even now, difficult to fully comprehend. As the early dynasties consolidated their power, the first and second dynasties, ruling from a capital near modern-day Cairo called Memphis, itself founded, according to tradition, by the same king who first unified the two lands, the ideology of divine kingship grew more elaborate, and the physical monuments meant to express that ideology grew more ambitious. Early Egyptian kings were buried in structures called mastabas, a word that fitting today comes from the Arabic term for a simple bed, because that is roughly what these early tombs resembled. Low, flat-topped rectangular structures built of mudbrick, containing underground burial chambers beneath a solid superstructure, surrounded by additional chambers for grave goods, sometimes accompanied by the burials of servants or officials meant to continue serving the king in the next life, a practice that appears in the very earliest royal tombs and then, notably, disappears, a change some scholars interpret as an early meaningful shift away from human sacrifice and toward other forms of symbolic provisioning for the afterlife. For roughly the first few centuries of the dynastic period, mastabas remained the standard form of elite and royal burial, modest by the standards of what would come later, but already reflecting careful attention to the journey of the soul after death, a concept that was becoming steadily more elaborate as Egyptian religious thought matured. Then, around 2650 BCE, something changed. A king named Giza of the Third Dynasty commissioned a monument unlike anything that had come before it, and the person credited with designing it, a man named Imhotep, would become one of the very few non-royal individuals in all of Egyptian history to be remembered, admired, and eventually even worshipped as a god in his own right, nearly 2,000 years after his death, revered by later generations as a legendary architect, physician, and sage. What Imhotep designed for Giza was, at its heart, an evolution of the mastaba, but instead of a single flat structure, he stacked mastabas of decreasing size on top of one another, 6 layers total, rising in a series of steps toward the sky. The result, built at Saqqara, near Memphis, was the Step Pyramid, the first monumental structure in human history built almost entirely from cut stone rather than mud brick, rising to a height of roughly 200 feet, surrounded by an elaborate walled complex containing courtyards, dummy buildings with no functional interior space, and shrines meant to serve Giza's spirit as he participated eternally in ritual festivals meant to renew his kingship even after death. Picture the effect this must have had on the people of the time, for their entire lives and for the lives of their parents and grandparents and every generation before them stretching back into memory. The tallest structures anyone had ever seen were modest mud brick buildings, palm groves, perhaps the occasional low mastaba tomb, and now, rising from the desert plateau at Saqqara, visible for miles across the flat valley floor, stood something that had never existed before anywhere on Earth, a mountain made by human hands, gleaming white in the sunlight, built from fine limestone that would have caught the light in a way mud brick never could. We do not know precisely how ordinary Egyptians understood this achievement, since we have no surviving accounts from common labourers or villagers describing their reactions. But we can reasonably imagine that it reinforced powerfully and visibly the idea already embedded in Egyptian religious thought that the king was not merely a man, but something closer to a bridge between the earthly world and the eternal one, someone whose power extended, quite literally, into the sky. The construction of the Step Pyramid also tells us something important about the organization of early Egyptian society. A project of this scale required coordinated labor, skilled stoneworkers, engineers capable of calculating loads and angles, administrators capable of tracking food and supplies for a workforce over years, and, Crucially, a state wealthy and organized enough to feed, house, and pay all of these people while they were not producing food themselves. In other words, the Step Pyramid was not simply an architectural achievement. It was evidence of an entire civilization's administrative capacity, its ability to mobilize resources across the length of the Nile Valley, and its deepening conviction that the king's eternal well-being was worth every bit of that effort. From this foundation, Egyptian pyramid building accelerated with remarkable speed. Within a century of Djoser's Step Pyramid, Egyptian architects and engineers had experimented their way toward the true, smooth-sided pyramid shape most people picture today. A shape thought to represent the primeval mound of earth that, according to Egyptian creation myths, first emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time, or alternatively, the descending rays of the sun itself, frozen into stone. The path to this achievement was not smooth. At a site called Midam, an early attempt at a true pyramid appears to have suffered a structural failure, its outer casing partially collapsing, whether during construction or sometime afterward remains debated among archaeologists. At Darsha, a king named Sneferu, father of the pharaoh, who would eventually build the most famous pyramid of all, commissioned a pyramid whose architects apparently grew concerned partway through construction about the structural stability of the angle they had chosen, and adjusted the slope partway up, resulting in a monument known today as the Bent Pyramid, its silhouette shifting visibly partway up its height, a rare and fascinating record of ancient engineers responding in real time to their own uncertainty and caution. Undeterred, Sneferu commissioned yet another pyramid nearby, this time built from the start at a shallower, more stable angle. This became the Red Pyramid, named for the reddish hue of its limestone core, and it stands to this day as the first successful true smooth-sided pyramid ever completed, a monument of trial, failure, adjustment, and eventual triumph, built not by magic or by mystery, as later legends would sometimes claim, but by patient, iterative human engineering, refined across successive projects, each one teaching the lessons the next would apply. It was Sneferu's son who would take everything learned across these earlier attempts and produce the monument that has, for more than 4,000 years, come to represent ancient Egypt more than any other single structure on Earth. His name was Khufu, and the pyramid he built at a desert plateau called Giza, just outside modern Cairo, would become the tallest human-made structure on the planet, a record it held for roughly 3,800 years, until the construction of medieval European cathedrals finally surpassed it, sometime around the year 1300 of the Common Era. Let us slow down here, because it is worth understanding not just what the Great Pyramid is, but how it came to exist, because the true story, pieced together from archaeological evidence gathered especially over the past several decades, is far more human, far more grounded, and, in its own way, far more remarkable than the myths of slave labor and lost technology that circulated for so long in popular imagination. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, completed sometime around 2560 BCE, originally stood at roughly 481 feet tall, constructed from an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone, most of them limestone quarried from the immediate vicinity of the Giza plateau itself, with finer white casing stone brought from quarries across the river at Tura, and massive granite blocks, weighing many tons each, transported from Aswan, more than 500 miles to the south, floated downriver on barges during the annual flood, when high water allowed boats to approach much closer to the construction site than would have been possible during the rest of the year. For a very long time, popular imagination, fed partly by ancient Greek writers like Herodotus, who visited Egypt some 2,000 years after the pyramids were built and recorded local traditions and guesswork rather than first-hand knowledge of the construction process, assumed the pyramids had been built by armies of enslaved people, driven by the whip, their lives considered worthless by a cruel and indifferent state. Archaeological work conducted especially since the 1990s, when excavations uncovered an entire settlement adjacent to the Giza pyramids specifically built to house the pyramid workforce, has substantially revised this picture. What archaeologists found was not evidence of a slave camp, but something closer to a highly organized company town. Barrack-style housing arranged with clear planning, bakeries capable of producing bread in enormous quantities, breweries for beer production, Evidence of meat consumption, including cattle and sheep bones, suggesting a diet significantly better than that of an average Egyptian farmer. And, perhaps most strikingly, a cemetery for workers who died during construction, where the dead were buried with the same care, the same modest grave goods, and occasionally the same proximity to the sacred pyramid complex that might be afforded to respected members of society, rather than discarded as expendable labourers would likely have been treated. The current scholarly understanding is that the pyramid workforce was drawn substantially from Egypt's own population, organised through a labour levy system in which villages and regions across the country were required to contribute workers, food and supplies for a portion of each year, likely coinciding, at least partly, with the months of the flood season, when agricultural work was impossible anyway, because the fields themselves lay underwater and a significant portion of the population would otherwise have had far less to occupy their labour. This does not mean the work was easy, comfortable, or free of coercion. Ancient labour systems, including Egyptian ones, involved obligations that ordinary people could not simply refuse, and conditions for labourers, even well-fed ones, involved genuine physical danger, exhausting effort, and almost certainly periods of real hardship, especially for those hauling multi-ton blocks of stone up ramps in the desert heat. But it does mean that the workforce building the pyramids largely understood themselves, in some meaningful sense, as participants in a national project connected to their king's eternal life, and, by extension, to the continued stability and prosperity of the entire kingdom, not as a captive population with no stake in the outcome. Graffiti left by work gangs inside the pyramids themselves, informal marks made by teams of labourers identifying their group, discovered in relieving chambers above the king's chamber, spaces never meant to be seen again once construction finished, give us some of our most intimate, unfiltered glimpses into how these workers understood their own labour. Team names recovered from such inscriptions include phrases that can be translated roughly as friends of Khufu and drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting a workforce with genuine pride, camaraderie, competitive spirit between teams, and even a certain irreverent humour about their own relationship to royal authority. Hardly what we might expect from a population labouring purely under threat of the whip. How, precisely, the blocks were moved and raised remains a subject of ongoing research and reasonable scholarly debate, though the old idea that this remains a total mystery, sometimes exaggerated in popular media into suggestions of lost technology or outside intervention, does not reflect the actual state of archaeological and engineering understanding. Evidence including ancient ramps, sledges, worker settlements, quarry marks, and tools recovered at construction sites, combined with careful engineering analysis, supports theories involving temporary earthen and rubble ramps, possibly straight, possibly spiralling around the pyramid's exterior, possibly a combination adjusted as construction proceeded, along with wooden sledges dragged across surfaces deliberately wetted to reduce friction, a technique actually depicted in surviving Egyptian tomb paintings, showing large statues being transported by teams of men, with a single figure standing at the front of the sledge pouring water or a similar liquid onto the ground just ahead of the sledge's path. Simple technologies applied with extraordinary organizational discipline, precise surveying, and an accumulated generations-deep understanding of stone, geometry, and labour management. This is what current evidence suggests actually built the Great Pyramid, rather than any single ingenious trick or forgotten science. It was, in the truest sense, an achievement of coordinated human effort on a scale the world had never before attempted, sustained not for a single dramatic season but across roughly 2 decades of continuous work involving, by most modern estimates, a rotating workforce that likely numbered in the tens of thousands at any given time, supported by an even larger network of farmers, herders, bakers, brewers, quarry workers, boat crews, and administrators across the length of the Nile Valley, all connected, in one way or another, to the ongoing project of building a mountain for a king who believed, and whose entire civilization believed alongside him, that his continued existence in the afterlife was inseparable from the continued well-being of everyone still living. Let us step for a while into the world of the people who lived and worked in the shadow of that rising monument, not the king himself, whose inner life remains almost entirely unknown to us despite his fame, but the ordinary men and women whose labor, food, and daily routines made the pyramid possible. Imagine a young man, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, arriving at Giza from a village somewhere in the delta, several weeks' journey downriver, called up as part of his village's labor obligation for the flood season. He would have traveled by boat, part of a larger group organized under a local official responsible for delivering the required number of workers to the construction site. Arriving at Giza for the first time, he would have seen, rising from the desert plateau, a structure larger than anything he had ever encountered. Not yet finished, its upper levels perhaps still under construction, surrounded by ramps, scaffolding, work gangs, ox carts, and the constant motion of an enormous purposeful human effort. He would have been assigned to a work gang, likely given a name, something proud, something with a sense of belonging, echoing those Friends of Khufu inscriptions discovered by archaeologists, and housed in the barrack settlement excavated just south of the pyramid complex, sleeping on simple mats alongside dozens of other men from his own region, men he would come to know well over the months of shared, exhausting labor. His days would have begun early, before the worst of the heat arrived, with a substantial breakfast of bread and beer functioning, in this context, less as an intoxicant and more as a safe, calorie-dense, nutrient-rich beverage, an important source of hydration and energy in a world without other reliable options. Archaeological evidence from the workers' towns suggests a diet that included regular meat consumption, a genuine luxury by the standards of ordinary Egyptian village life, likely provided specifically to sustain a workforce performing extraordinarily demanding physical labor. His actual work might have involved hauling limestone blocks on wooden sledges up constructed ramps, or working in the nearby quarries cutting stone with copper tools and wooden wedges soaked in water to split blocks along natural fault lines, or transporting water, food, and supplies between the barracks and the construction site, or assisting the skilled masons, a smaller specialized group of permanent workers distinct from the seasonal levy laborers who possessed the precise skills needed to dress and fit stone blocks with the accuracy the pyramid required. Evenings would have brought rest, food, perhaps games of senet played by firelight, conversation among men far from their own families and villages, forming the kinds of bonds that shared hardship and shared purpose tend to produce among people working towards something larger than themselves. And running beneath all of it, we can reasonably imagine a genuine sense, impossible to fully verify from this historical distance, but strongly suggested by the evidence of worker pride recovered from the monument itself, that they were participating in something that mattered, something connected to the survival and prosperity of Egypt as a whole, something that would outlast every one of them individually. When the flood season ended and the fields became workable again, many of these levy workers would have returned home, back to their villages, back to planting and harvesting, carrying with them stories of the great construction they had helped build. Stories that would have spread, inevitably, up and down the Nile, reinforcing again and again, across the whole of Egyptian society, the sense that the king's monument was, in some real sense, everyone's monument, built by hands drawn from every region of the Black Land, in service of a cosmic order that all of them, in their own quiet way, depended upon. Not everyone at Giza was a seasonal laborer, of course. The construction required a substantial permanent workforce as well. Skilled masons, sculptors, scribes, and administrators, along with the officials responsible for coordinating the entire operation, some of them drawn from Egypt's growing class of educated bureaucrats, a group whose importance to Egyptian civilization is easy to underestimate today, but whose careful record-keeping, resource management, and administrative skill were every bit as essential to the pyramid's completion as the physical labor of hauling stone. Scribes held a uniquely respected position in Egyptian society. Literacy was rare, likely limited to a small percentage of the population, concentrated among the sons of officials, priests, and wealthier families who could afford the years of dedicated schooling required to master hieroglyphic and the faster cursive, hieratic script used for everyday administrative documents. A scribal education began young, often around age 5, and continued for years, involving rigorous memorization, repeated copying of model texts, and no small amount of physical discipline. Surviving school texts include passages in which teachers explicitly warn students that a boy's ears are on his back, meaning that he listens best when beaten, a grim but historically honest detail about the harshness of ancient education, even as other surviving texts express genuine affection and pride between teachers and their most promising students. Once trained, a scribe's life offered a path toward genuine social advancement unavailable through almost any other route in Egyptian society. Scribes managed grain stores, recorded tax obligations, documented court proceedings, tracked construction projects, composed royal inscriptions, and served as the essential connective tissue of an enormously complex state apparatus that, without writing, could never have coordinated projects on the scale of the Giza pyramids. A famous piece of surviving Egyptian wisdom literature, composed to encourage boys towards scribal careers, contrasts the scribe's life favorably against nearly every other occupation available in Egyptian society. Describing the washerman's exhausting labor at the riverbank among crocodiles, the potter's endless work covered in clay up to his eyes, the farmer's precarious dependence on weather and flood, the soldier's dangerous life on campaign, concluding, again and again, that no profession compares to that of the scribe, whose tools are simple, whose work is respected, and whose advancement depends on skill rather than the harsh unpredictability facing nearly every other trade in ancient Egyptian life. This text should be read with some skepticism, of course. It was written by scribes, for scribes, with an obvious interest in praising their own profession above all others. But it offers something valuable nonetheless. A rare direct window into how educated ancient Egyptians understood the texture and hierarchy of their own society, the genuine hardships facing farmers, craftsmen and soldiers, and the aspiration, among ambitious families, to secure for their sons a path toward literacy, stability and respect. As the Great Pyramid neared completion, its smooth white limestone casing stones, quarried across the river at Tura, cut and polished to a precision that allowed adjoining blocks to fit together with almost no visible gap between them, would have transformed its appearance entirely from the stepped, unfinished structure visible during most of its construction. Ancient accounts and surviving traces of casing stones near the pyramid's base suggest that, when complete, the Great Pyramid would have gleamed, brilliant white, visible from a tremendous distance across the flat desert and the green valley beyond it, catching the sunlight in a way that must have seemed, to anyone witnessing it for the first time, genuinely otherworldly. A structure that appeared less built than grown, less human than divine, radiating exactly the kind of awe and permanence its architects and its king intended it to project for eternity. At its very peak sat a capstone, likely gilded or covered in a reflective material, that would have caught the very first and very last light of each day, blazing gold above the pale stone body of the pyramid below, an architectural echo, deliberate and unmistakable, of the sun itself rising and setting day after day, exactly as the Egyptians believed their king's soul would rise, eternally, into the company of the sun god Ra, joining him each day on his endless voyage across the sky. Before we let the pyramid rest in that fading light, it is worth widening our view a little further, out beyond Giza, out beyond the men hauling stone and the scribes tallying grain, into the broader fabric of the society that made such a monument conceivable in the first place. A society that was in many respects more balanced, more connected, and more textured than the image of an isolated desert kingdom sometimes suggests. Consider for a moment the position of women in Old Kingdom Egypt, which stood, by the standards of the ancient world, in a genuinely notable place. Egyptian women could own property in their own name, could initiate divorce, could inherit and bequeath land and goods independently of their husbands, could testify in legal proceedings, and could, in some documented cases, run businesses or manage substantial households entirely on their own authority. This did not mean Egyptian society was equal in the way we might use that word today. Public office, priesthood at the highest levels, and military leadership remained overwhelmingly the domain of men, and the ideal Egyptian household, as reflected in art and literature, still centered a wife's role around the home, children, and domestic management. But the legal and economic standing of Egyptian women was real, documented across thousands of surviving contracts, wills, and court records, and it struck later visitors from Greece and Rome, whose own societies afforded women far fewer independent rights, as something worth remarking upon with a mixture of curiosity and mild disapproval. A woman managing a household in this period, whether the wife of a farmer, a craftsman, or a minor official, would have overseen an enormous range of responsibilities. The grinding of grain into flour, a task so physically demanding and so constant that skeletal remains of Egyptian women from this era frequently show pronounced wear in the knees, spine, and toes from the repetitive kneeling and grinding motion performed for hours nearly every day. The brewing of beer, essential to the household diet, the spinning and weaving of linen, transforming raw flax into the thread and then the cloth that clothed the entire family. The raising of young children, nursed for extended periods, often 2 to 3 years, a practice that likely served, whether consciously understood or not, as a natural form of birth spacing in a world without other reliable options, and the maintenance of household religious practice, tending small shrines, making offerings to protective deities, observing the countless small rituals believed to keep a family safe from illness, misfortune, and the ever-present possibility of divine displeasure. Marriage itself in ancient Egypt was a relatively informal institution by later standards. There is no clear evidence of a religious wedding ceremony in the way later cultures would come to understand one. A couple was generally considered married once they began living together, and, often, once a formal contract had been drawn up, particularly among families with property to protect, specifying the division of goods in the event of divorce, which appears to have been reasonably common and did not carry the severe social stigma it would in many later societies. Egyptian love poetry, some of which survives from later periods but reflects sentiments likely present much earlier as well, speaks with surprising tenderness and directness about romantic longing, physical attraction, and the ache of separation, offering us some of the most emotionally intimate surviving voices from the ancient world. Ordinary, human, unguarded feelings, expressed across a gap of more than 3,000 years, that still read today as instantly recognizable. Beyond the household, Egypt's position along the Nile also placed it at the center of a surprisingly wide web of trade and contact stretching well beyond its own borders. Cedar wood, essential for boat building and largely unavailable within Egypt itself, was imported from the region of modern Lebanon, carried by ships that made the journey across the eastern Mediterranean and back. Copper and turquoise came from mining expeditions into the Sinai Peninsula, dangerous journeys through genuinely hostile desert terrain, commemorated in inscriptions left behind by the expedition leaders at mining sites, some of which still survive, carved into rock faces, recording prayers for safe passage and successful returns. Gold, which would come to define Egypt's reputation across the ancient world so thoroughly that other Bronze Age rulers, in surviving diplomatic letters from later periods, would write to the Egyptian king with only half-joking complaints that gold was, in Egypt, as plentiful as dust, arrived from the deserts to the east, and increasingly over time, from Nubia to the south, whose very name likely derives from the ancient Egyptian word for gold itself. Nubia deserves particular attention here, not simply as a source of resources, but as a civilization in its own right, one whose relationship with Egypt would remain complicated, close, and consequential across the entire span of Egyptian history. Sometimes a trading partner, sometimes a conquered territory, sometimes, especially much later, a rival power whose own kings would eventually rule over Egypt itself. Even in this early period, expeditions travelled south beyond the First Cataract, seeking not just gold, but ebony, ivory, incense, exotic animals, and enslaved captives, establishing patterns of exchange and at times exploitation that would continue in various forms for thousands of years. All of this, the trade expeditions, the household economies, the scribal bureaucracy, the seasonal labour levies, the careful maintenance of Ma'at through royal ritual, fed into and depended upon a state administrative structure of genuine sophistication for its time. Egypt was divided into provinces, later called nomes by Greek writers, each governed by an official responsible for local administration, tax collection, and the mobilization of labor and resources when the central government required them. Grain, collected as tax and stored in state granaries, functioned as a form of insurance against the ever-present risk of a poor flood. A bad harvest in one region could, in principle, be offset by surplus grain redistributed from elsewhere, though the system's effectiveness varied considerably depending on the competence and honesty of the officials responsible for managing it, a vulnerability that would matter a great deal later in our story. when the strength of this administrative system came under genuine strain. For now, though, in the era of Sneferu, Khufu and the pyramids rising at Giza, the system was working about as well as it ever would. Grain flowed into royal storehouses. Labour flowed toward royal construction projects. Trade expeditions returned from Sinai, from Nubia, from across the sea, carrying copper, gold, cedar and incense back toward the Nile. And underlying all of it, sustaining the confidence required to build a mountain of stone for a single man's eternal life, sat an unshaken conviction that the universe itself rewarded order, that the king's rituals genuinely kept chaos at bay, and that a life lived in accordance with Ma'at, whether as a king commissioning a pyramid, a scribe recording a harvest, or a woman grinding grain in a courtyard at dawn, was a life properly aligned with the deepest truths of existence. We will return before long to what the Egyptians believed happened inside that voyage, what a soul was thought to be made of, what dangers it faced, what judgment awaited it, and how an ordinary person, not just a king, might hope to survive death and continue existing in some meaningful way beyond it. We will walk through the quiet, careful rituals of mummification, through the images of gods with the heads of animals, through a heart weighed against a single feather in a hall lit by flickering lamps, in a story the Egyptians told themselves and clung to for 3,000 years. But that is a story for later in our journey together, when the light outside has grown fully dark and the mind is ready to drift somewhere quieter, somewhere older, somewhere between waking and sleep. Khufu's own son, a king named Khafre, would eventually build a second pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller than his father's but positioned on higher ground, so that from certain angles along the valley below, it can appear almost equal in height. Whether this was a deliberate visual choice by Khafre's architects, or simply a consequence of the plateau's natural slope, remains a matter of gentle scholarly debate, though it is tempting to imagine a son wanting his own monument to stand, at least from some vantage points, eye to eye with his father's. Beside Khafre's pyramid, carved directly from a single outcropping of bedrock left over from the limestone quarried to build the pyramids themselves, sits the Great Sphinx, a reclining lion with a human face, widely though not universally believed by modern scholars to bear the likeness of Khafre himself, gazing eastward across the valley toward the rising sun. Its origins remain, even now, one of the more genuinely open questions in Egyptology, since no inscription from Khafre's own time explicitly identifies its builder or its intended meaning, leaving room for careful ongoing scholarly reassessment rather than certainty. What we do know is that the Sphinx, weathered by wind and sand for thousands of years, buried up to its shoulders more than once over the millennia, and excavated again by later generations who found it as mysterious and as moving as we do today, has watched the sun rise over the Nile Valley for longer than almost any other human-made object on Earth. A third, notably smaller pyramid was added at Giza by Khafre's successor, Menkaure, a monument modest by comparison to its two towering neighbours, yet still an undertaking that would have consumed enormous resources and years of labour by any ordinary measure, its comparative smallness perhaps reflecting a subtly changing political and economic reality within Egypt itself, as the tremendous cost of building at the scale of Khufu and Khafre began, gradually, to strain even the considerable wealth of the Egyptian state. In the centuries that followed, pyramids continued to be built by subsequent kings, but never again at quite the scale achieved on the Giza Plateau during this remarkable stretch of 2 or 3 generations, a brief, concentrated era measured against the vast span of Egyptian history, in which an entire civilization seemed to align itself, almost completely, around the singular ambition of building mountains for its kings. Standing today at the edge of the Giza Plateau, looking out across 3 pyramids and a reclining stone lion with a human face, it is easy to forget that these monuments were never meant to be admired as ruins, as curiosities from a vanished world. They were built as living instruments, machines, in a sense, for eternity, designed to keep a king's spirit properly connected to the sun, to the stars, to the endless cycle of rising and setting that the Egyptians believed governed not just the sky above them, but the fate of every soul that had ever lived beside their river. For now, let the great pyramids of Giza stand finished against the sky, gleaming in the last light of an evening 4,500 years gone, their workers gone home to their villages, their inner chambers sealed in silence, and the Sphinx gazing quietly eastward, waiting as it always has, for the sun to rise again over the black land and the red land, the river beginning once more, patient as ever, to swell toward flood. The river rose again, as it always did, and as the waters crept back over the black land, spreading silt across fields that had, only weeks before, stood dry and cracked beneath the summer sun, the people of the Nile Valley returned to a question that had followed them since the very first burials in the very first villages, long before any king had worn a crown, long before any stone had been lifted toward the sky. What happens to a person after the last breath leaves them? It is a question every human civilization has asked in its own way, but few societies in history answered it with the patience, the detail, and the sheer creative devotion that the ancient Egyptians brought to it. Death, for the Egyptians, was never treated as an ending to be feared into silence. It was treated as a journey, dangerous, uncertain, requiring preparation, but ultimately survivable, provided a person had lived rightly, been buried properly, and carried with them the correct knowledge to navigate what came next. To understand this journey, we first need to understand what the Egyptians believed a person actually was, because, in their view, a human being was not one single unified thing, the way many of us today might casually think of a soul. A person was composed of several distinct parts, each with its own nature, its own needs, and its own role to play both in life and after death. There was the body itself, the physical form, which the Egyptians believed needed to be preserved as completely as possible, because it served as an anchor point, a home for the other elements of a person's being to return to. There was the ka, often described as a person's life force or vital spirit, something that came into being at the moment of birth, alongside the physical body, almost like an invisible twin. After death, the ka needed to be sustained, just as the living body had needed food and drink, which is why Egyptian tombs, from the very earliest periods onward, included offerings of bread, beer, meat, and other provisions, either real or, more commonly in later periods, represented through painted images and carved reliefs on tomb walls, since a properly executed image, in Egyptian belief, carried genuine magical efficacy, capable of sustaining the ka for eternity, even after the physical offerings themselves had long since decayed or been consumed by visitors, priests, or simply time. There was the ba, often visualized in Egyptian art as a bird with a human head, representing something closer to a person's individual character, their mobility after death, their capacity to move between the world of the living and the world of the dead, to leave the tomb by day and return to the body by night, drawn back, again and again, to the place where it belonged. And there was the Ak, a transformed, glorified spirit, representing the successful union of the ka and the ba after death, the final ideal state a person hoped to achieve, an existence among the imperishable stars, those constellations near the northern sky that never set below the horizon and therefore seemed, to careful Egyptian observers of the night sky, to represent a kind of eternity made visible, stars that circled forever without ever disappearing into darkness. To become an Ak, to achieve this successful eternal transformation, required several things to go correctly. The body needed to be preserved, the correct rituals needed to be performed, the correct knowledge needed to be carried into the afterlife, often literally, in the form of written spells and instructions. And, perhaps most importantly of all, the person's heart needed to pass a final decisive judgment. Let us walk, slowly, through what actually happened to a body after death in ancient Egypt, not through legend or exaggeration, but through the genuinely remarkable, painstaking process that Egyptian embalmers developed and refined across many centuries, a process so effective that it has left us, even now, thousands of years later, faces we can still recognize, hair we can still see, expressions frozen at the edge of eternity. Mummification was not performed the same way for everyone. For the wealthy and the royal, it could take a full 70 days, involving priests, specialized embalmers, and an entire workshop of trained professionals. For those of more modest means, simpler and far less expensive versions of the process existed, sometimes involving little more than packing the body in natron, a naturally occurring salt found in dry lake beds within Egypt, and allowing the desert climate itself to do much of the preservation work, a method not so different, in principle, from the earliest pre-dynastic burials we spoke of before, when bodies placed directly into hot, dry sand were naturally desiccated and preserved without any human intervention at all. For the elaborate version of the process, embalmers began by removing the organs most prone to rapid decay. The brain, considered by the Egyptians to be a relatively unimportant organ, its true function not yet understood, since they believed thought and emotion originated in the heart rather than the brain, was typically removed through the nostril using a long hooked instrument, broken apart and extracted in pieces, then discarded since it was not thought worth preserving. The heart, by dramatic contrast, was left in place within the body, or, if accidentally removed during the process, carefully replaced before burial, because the heart was considered essential, the seat of a person's intelligence, emotion, memory, and moral character, and, as we will soon see, the single organ whose condition would determine a person's fate in the judgment awaiting them beyond death. Other major organs, the liver, lungs, stomach and intestines, were removed through a small incision in the left side of the body, treated with natron and resin, and placed into 4 separate containers known today as canopic jars, each one traditionally protected by one of 4 minor deities called the 4 sons of Horus, each with a distinct head: human, baboon, jackal and falcon, a system of careful symbolic protection extended to every part of the body, down to its smallest, most vulnerable components. The body itself, now emptied of its most perishable organs, was packed and covered with natron and left to dry for a period of roughly 40 days, drawing out moisture in much the same way the desert sand had once done naturally for early pre-dynastic burials, except now under far more careful and controlled conditions. Once sufficiently dried, the body was cleansed, anointed with oils and resins meant to keep the skin supple and to provide a pleasant fragrance, sometimes packed internally with linen, sawdust, or other materials to help restore something closer to its living shape, and then, finally, wrapped, carefully, methodically, layer upon layer, in strips of linen, a process that could use hundreds of yards of cloth and take many days on its own. With amulets tucked between the wrappings at specific points on the body, each one selected for its particular protective or magical property, positioned according to careful ritual instruction, so that the finished mummy became, in effect, both a preserved physical body and a walking assembly of protective magic, wound layer over layer around the person it was meant to carry safely into eternity. Throughout this entire process, priests recited spells and prayers, many of which survive today, inscribed on tomb walls or written on papyrus scrolls placed within the wrappings themselves or beside the body in the burial chamber, a body of religious and magical texts that scholars today refer to collectively, somewhat imprecisely but usefully, as the Book of the Dead, though the Egyptians themselves knew this collection by a rather more evocative title, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a name that captures, better than our modern label does, the essential hope embedded in the entire mummification process, not simply preservation for its own sake, but preparation for a journey, an eventual emergence, a coming forth once again into the light. And what awaited the dead, once properly prepared, once the correct spells had been spoken, once the Bear had been given the freedom to travel between worlds, was a journey through the underworld the Egyptians called the Duat, a realm imagined as a shadowy mirror of the world above, filled with dangers, demons, gates that had to be passed through in the correct order, each one guarded by a fearsome figure whose name had to be known and correctly spoken in order to proceed. This is part of why the Book of the Dead exists at all, and why it was considered so essential to include a copy, or portions of one, within a person's tomb. It functioned, in a very real and practical sense the Egyptians themselves understood clearly, as a kind of guidebook for the afterlife, a collection of spells offering protection against specific dangers, correct answers to specific questions posed by specific guardians, and instructions for navigating a landscape that, however imaginative it might seem to us now, was treated by the Egyptians with the same careful, practical seriousness they might apply to a genuinely difficult physical journey through unfamiliar desert terrain, because, in their understanding, that is essentially what it was. At the heart of this journey stood a single decisive moment, depicted again and again in Egyptian tomb art and funerary papyri, with such consistency that it clearly represented one of the most central beliefs in the entire religious system, the weighing of the heart. Picture the scene as the Egyptians themselves imagined and painted it in vivid, careful detail across countless surviving papyri, a great hall lit by the presence of the gods themselves rather than any ordinary lamp, Osiris, lord of the dead, seated upon his throne, green-skinned, wrapped like a mummy himself, holding the crook and flail that marked him as king even in death. Before him stands a large set of scales. On one side of the scale rests the heart of the person who has died, carried carefully through the trials of the underworld specifically for this moment. On the other side rests a single feather, the feather of Maat, that same concept of truth, order, and cosmic balance that govern the living world above, now made physical, weighed directly against the deeds and character of a human life. Anubis, the jackal-headed god associated with embalming and the care of the dead, tends the scale itself, watching the balance carefully. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, wisdom, and knowledge, stands nearby with his writing implements, ready to record the result. And crouched beside the scale, waiting, sits a creature the Egyptians called Ammit, the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, combining, quite deliberately, the three animals ancient Egyptians considered most dangerous, most capable of sudden, violent death along the Nile. If the heart proved lighter than the feather, or balanced evenly with it, if the person had lived a life reasonably aligned with Ma'at, had not burdened their heart with serious wrongdoing, had been honest, had not stolen, had not murdered, had not violated the fundamental fabric of order and justice that bound Egyptian society together, then the deceased was declared true of voice, judged worthy, and permitted to continue onward, toward the fields of Osiris, a paradise imagined as a gentler, more abundant version of the Nile Valley itself, where grain grew taller than anywhere in the living world, where the flood never failed, where the deceased could farm, fish, and live in the same familiar, comfortable rhythms they had known in life, except now free from hunger, illness, and the fear of death itself. If, however, the heart proved heavier than the feather, weighed down by wrongdoing, dishonesty, cruelty, a life lived against the grain of Ma'at, then Ammit waited to devour it, and with the heart consumed, the person faced not eternal punishment in the way later religious traditions would imagine hell, but something the Egyptians seem to have considered even more frightening, complete and permanent non-existence, a second death, final and absolute, erasing the person entirely from both the world of the living and the world of the dead, denying them any continued existence at all. Notice, if you will, what this belief tells us about the values Egyptian society held closest. It was not enough to be a king, or wealthy, or powerful, or even properly mummified with the finest linen and the most expensive amulets, in order to guarantee a favourable outcome. The judgment centred on conduct, on truthfulness, on kindness, on restraint, on one's treatment of others. Surviving copies of the Book of the Dead include a remarkable passage, often called the Negative Confession, in which the deceased addresses a panel of divine judges directly, declaring, one by one, the wrongs they claim never to have committed. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not caused anyone pain, I have not been the cause of another's tears, I have not deprived the poor of their bread, I have not held back the floodwater in its season, I have not been deaf to words of truth. Whether or not any individual life actually lived up to every one of these claims, the list itself offers us something valuable, a clear, direct statement, preserved across thousands of years, of exactly what ordinary Egyptians believed a good and honest life required, values that, read today, feel remarkably close to the moral instincts many of us still recognize and hold dear. This entire framework of belief, the careful preservation of the body, the guidebook spells, the weighing of the heart, did not remain static across Egyptian history. It evolved considerably over time, and one of the more striking shifts concerns exactly who was believed to be entitled to this kind of afterlife in the first place. In the earliest periods of Egyptian history, and especially during the age of the Great Pyramids we explored earlier, the most elaborate afterlife beliefs and the most powerful funerary magic were largely reserved for the king alone. Texts inscribed inside the burial chambers of later Old Kingdom pyramids, a collection scholars call the Pyramid Texts, among the oldest religious writings known anywhere in the world, describe the king's journey after death in terms that assume, almost without exception, that he alone possesses the divine nature necessary to join the sun god Ra on his eternal journey across the sky, or to become identified with Osiris, ruler of the dead. Ordinary people, in this earliest theological framework, were not necessarily understood to share in this particular kind of glorious afterlife at all. Their fate after death remained comparatively vague, tied more to sustaining offerings and the ongoing care of the living than to any elaborate cosmic journey of their own. But over the centuries that followed, and especially during the period we will turn to shortly, following the collapse of Old Kingdom central authority, this exclusivity gradually broke down. Funerary texts and spells that had once been the exclusive property of kings, inscribed only within royal pyramids, began appearing on the coffins of non-royal officials and, eventually, on papyri available to a much broader segment of Egyptian society who could afford to commission them. A development modern scholars sometimes call, with a certain dry understatement, the democratization of the afterlife. By the time of the New Kingdom, the era of the great pharaohs whose stories we will turn to shortly, the fully developed Book of the Dead, complete with its judgment scene and its promise of eternal life in the fields of Osiris, had become available, in principle, to any Egyptian who could afford the necessary burial preparations. A genuinely significant shift in religious thought, extending the hope of a meaningful, examined, morally weighed eternity from a single divine king to the whole of Egyptian society, however unevenly that hope remained distributed in practice by wealth and circumstance. It is worth pausing here, gently, before we move forward in time, to sit with how this belief system must have shaped the emotional texture of ordinary Egyptian life. Because a civilization that thinks this carefully, this elaborately, about death rarely does so out of simple fear alone. There is comfort woven into all of this complexity. A person facing illness, old age, or the ever-present dangers of childbirth, warfare, or accident along the river did not face these dangers believing that death meant simple, silent erasure. They faced it believing that a good life, honestly lived, would be recognized, weighed fairly, and rewarded with continuation. Not floating and formless, but familiar, grounded, filled with grain and river and family, a paradise that looked remarkably like the very valley they already called home, simply perfected, simply freed from hunger and fear. This, perhaps, is part of why Egyptian Tuam art so often depicts scenes of ordinary happiness rather than solemn grief. A nobleman hunting birds in the marshes, a family seated together at a table laden with bread and fruit, servants tending fields of grain beneath a warm and steady sun. These were not idle decorations. They were, in the Egyptian understanding, functional images, magically capable of providing eternally the very activities and comforts they depicted. Death, approached this way, becomes not an erasure of the good things in life, but their preservation, made permanent, made safe from the ordinary decay and loss that touches everything in the world of the living. Before we leave this world of God's judgment and eternal fields behind, it is worth stepping briefly into the temples themselves, the great stone houses of the gods that anchored nearly every significant town along the Nile, and whose daily rhythms shaped Egyptian religious life far more continuously than any single dramatic scene of judgment in the afterlife. It is a common misconception, understandable but mistaken, to imagine Egyptian temples as public gathering places, somewhere an ordinary family might go together on a given morning the way one might visit a church, mosque, or synagogue today. In reality, the innermost sanctuary of an Egyptian temple, where a small statue of the resident god was kept, dressed, fed and cared for daily, was considered so sacred that only the king himself, or priests acting formally on his behalf, were permitted to enter it. Every morning, in temples across Egypt, a priest would perform the daily ritual of waking the god, approaching the shrine, breaking its seal, opening its doors, and greeting the divine image with hymns and incense, before washing it, anointing it with oil, dressing it in fresh linen, and presenting it with food offerings, which were later removed, redistributed among the temple staff, and in a sense considered to have already received their essential spiritual nourishment even after the god had, in Egyptian belief, absorbed their true sustenance. Ordinary Egyptians rarely witnessed any of this directly. Their experience of temple religion came instead through the outer courtyards, open to a somewhat wider public on certain occasions, and especially through the great festivals, when a god statue, sealed within a portable shrine, was carried out of the temple on the shoulders of priests and paraded through the streets or transported along the Nile by boat, allowing crowds of ordinary people who would otherwise never come close to the god's actual sacred image, to gather, celebrate, offer prayers, and in some cases even pose questions to the god, whose priests would interpret the movement or tilt of the carried shrine as a form of divine answer, a practice known as oracular consultation that appears to have grown especially popular during the New Kingdom, offering common people a rare, direct channel to divine guidance on personal and legal matters alike. The priesthood itself, particularly at Egypt's largest and wealthiest temples, such as the Temple of Amun at Karnak, grew, especially during the New Kingdom, into an institution of genuine economic and political significance, controlling vast estates of farmland, herds of livestock, workshops, and a share of the tribute and trade wealth flowing into Egypt from its expanding sphere of military and diplomatic influence. Priests were not, for most of Egyptian history, a fully separate class living apart from society in permanent religious seclusion. Many priestly positions were held on a rotating basis, a system in which men served in the temple for a portion of each year, and returned to ordinary civic and family life for the remainder, meaning that priesthood functioned, for a significant portion of the literate male population, as one respected role among several rather than an all-consuming exclusive vocation. This growing wealth and independence of the priesthood, particularly the priesthood of Amun at Thebes, is part of the essential background against which Akhenaten's later religious revolution, which we will come to shortly, must be understood. A revolution that was, in some real sense, as much a confrontation between royal and priestly power as it was a purely theological transformation. Let us return now to the river of history itself, flowing forward from the age of the pyramids, because Egyptian civilization, for all its apparent stability, was never entirely free from crisis. Sometime around 2180 BCE, roughly 4 centuries after Khufu's pyramid was completed, the centralized authority that had made such monuments possible began to weaken. Historians are still piecing together exactly why, but the evidence points toward a combination of causes working together rather than any single dramatic event. A series of unusually low Nile floods, possibly connected to broader climate shifts affecting rainfall patterns in the distant highlands, where the river's waters originated. The growing power and independence of regional governors, who had, over generations, accumulated increasing wealth, land and authority in their own provinces, sometimes passing their positions down through their own families, rather than remaining fully dependent on royal appointment. And the simple, accumulating strain of maintaining a highly centralized state across such a vast stretch of territory for so many centuries without modern tools of communication or control. Whatever the precise combination of causes, the result was a period modern historians call the First Intermediate Period, lasting roughly a century and a half, during which centralized royal authority effectively collapsed, Egypt fractured into competing regional power centers, and the confident optimism reflected in Old Kingdom art and religious texts gave way to something more anxious, more uncertain, more willing to openly acknowledge suffering and disorder. Some of the most striking literary texts to survive from ancient Egypt come from this unsettled era, works of genuine reflection and lament that describe, with real emotional force, a world in which the river seemed to fail, in which social order seemed to invert, in which the poor and the wealthy seemed to have traded places, and in which even the reliability of Maat itself seemed suddenly frighteningly in question. Whether these texts describe an actual, literal state of chaos, or whether they were composed somewhat later, as a kind of dramatic literary device meant to celebrate, by contrast, the restoration of order that eventually followed, scholars continue to debate. But either way, they offer us something valuable. Direct evidence that the Egyptians themselves understood their own civilization's stability as something that could break, that had broken before, and that required real effort, real leadership, and real reunification to restore. That restoration eventually came from the south, from a city called Thebes, previously a relatively minor provincial center, whose local rulers gradually extended their authority northward, defeating rival power centers one by one until, around 2050 BCE, a Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II succeeded in reuniting all of Egypt under a single crown once more, inaugurating the period historians call the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom, spanning roughly the next 4 centuries, is sometimes described by historians as a kind of classical age of Egyptian culture, a period when Egyptian literature reached extraordinary heights of sophistication, when the Egyptian language itself, in the form used during this era, became the standard against which later generations of Egyptians would measure elegant, proper writing for the rest of their civilization's existence, much the way later European cultures would look back to certain classical periods of Latin or Greek as models of linguistic excellence. It was during the Middle Kingdom that some of the most enduring works of Egyptian storytelling were composed, including the tale of a court official named Sinuhe, who flees Egypt after the death of a king out of fear and uncertainty, lives for years in exile among foreign peoples to the east, achieves wealth and respect in that foreign land, and yet remains haunted by a longing to return home and eventually be buried properly in Egyptian soil, according to Egyptian custom, a story that captures, with remarkable emotional nuance for a text nearly 4,000 years old, the universal ache of the exile, the specific Egyptian anxiety about dying and being buried far from the Nile, and the powerful, almost gravitational pull that the idea of home exerted on the Egyptian imagination. Middle Kingdom rulers also pursued significant practical achievements, particularly in the region south of Cairo called the Fayyum, a natural depression connected to the Nile by a channel where ambitious irrigation and water management projects expanded cultivable land considerably, and in Nubia to the south, where a chain of massive mudbrick fortresses was constructed along the Nile to secure Egyptian control over increasingly valuable trade routes and gold-bearing regions. Some of these fortresses so well engineered that their ruins remain impressive even today, testament to a state that had rebuilt, and in some ways refined, the administrative and engineering capacity first developed during the age of the pyramids. Yet the Middle Kingdom, too, eventually weakened, entering a second period of fragmentation historians call the Second Intermediate Period, during which a group the Egyptians called the Hyksos, a term meaning roughly rulers of foreign lands, likely people of West Asian origin, who had gradually settled in the Eastern Delta over preceding generations, bringing with them new technologies including, significantly, the horse-drawn chariot and improved bronze working techniques, established their own ruling dynasty over northern Egypt, while native Egyptian rulers retained control of the south from their base at Thebes. This period of foreign rule in the north is remembered, in later Egyptian sources composed after the fact, with considerable bitterness and resentment, though modern archaeological evidence suggests the actual relationship was more complicated than pure conquest and oppression, involving considerable cultural exchange, trade, and even periods of relative cooperation alongside genuine tension, and eventually open conflict. What matters most for the shape of our story is what happened next. A line of Theban rulers drawing on the wealth, organization, and, crucially, the new military technology introduced during the period of Hyksos rule, particularly the horse-drawn war chariot, gradually pushed northward, driving the Hyksos rulers out of Egypt entirely, and, for the first time in Egyptian history, pursuing them beyond Egypt's traditional borders into the neighboring lands of the eastern Mediterranean. This military campaign, completed around 1550 BCE under a king named Ahmose, did more than simply restore Egyptian unity. It launched Egypt into an entirely new relationship with the wider world, inaugurating the period historians call the New Kingdom, the era of Egypt's greatest territorial extent, its most famous pharaohs, its most dazzling wealth, and, eventually, some of its most consequential and dramatic internal upheavals. The New Kingdom, spanning roughly the next 500 years, transformed Egypt from a civilization defined primarily by the boundaries of its own river valley into something closer to an empire, with military campaigns extending Egyptian influence southward deep into Nubia and northward into the region of the Levant, along the eastern Mediterranean coast, bringing Egypt into direct, sustained contact, sometimes through trade and diplomacy, sometimes through warfare, with other major powers of the ancient Near East, including the Hittites of Anatolia, the Kingdom of Mitanni, and later the rising power of Assyria. One of the most militarily accomplished rulers of this era was a king named Thutmose III, who led numerous campaigns into the Levant over the course of his reign, and is remembered by many modern historians as one of the most successful military commanders of the ancient world, expanding Egyptian influence and tribute-collecting authority across a wider territory than any Egyptian ruler before him. Detailed records of his campaigns, inscribed on temple walls at Karnak, preserve what may be among the earliest surviving detailed military battle accounts in human history, describing troop movements, strategic decisions, and the tribute and captives brought back to Egypt following successful campaigns, wealth that flowed, in turn, into the temples, monuments, and luxuries that increasingly defined New Kingdom Egyptian civilization. Behind the grand inscriptions describing royal victories at Karnak stood, of course, ordinary soldiers, whose own experience of these campaigns has left behind a much quieter, more human trace in the historical record. Egyptian armies of the New Kingdom drew soldiers through a mixture of standing professional units and conscription, particularly from among the peasant population, alongside foreign mercenaries recruited from Nubia and elsewhere, prized for particular specialized skills such as archery. A soldier's life involved long, dusty marches through unfamiliar foreign territory, extended periods away from home and family for men whose entire prior experience of the world may have consisted of little more than their own village and its immediate surroundings, genuine danger in battle, and the constant, practical difficulties of supply and provisioning across campaigns that might last many months at a stretch. Surviving letters between soldiers and their families, along with the same body of scribal wisdom literature that praised the comfortable, seated life of the scribe above nearly every other occupation, describe a soldier's existence in terms considerably less glamorous than the triumphant battle reliefs carved onto temple walls might suggest. Long marches under a punishing sun, inadequate food, the constant risk of disease, and the real possibility of death or serious injury far from the comforts of the Nile Valley, in landscapes that must have felt, to a young Egyptian conscript raised beside his familiar, gentle river, remarkably alien and threatening. And yet successful campaigns also offered genuine opportunity, a share of captured plunder, the possibility of land grants and elevated status upon return, and, for the most successful and capable soldiers, a path toward officer rank and lasting royal favour, not unlike the social mobility that scribal literacy offered through an entirely different route. It is worth remembering, as we speak of pharaohs and their glorious campaigns, that every one of those campaigns was carried on the backs, quite literally, of thousands of ordinary young men, most of them nameless to history, whose own hopes, fears, and homesick letters home have left us some of the most quietly affecting personal writing to survive from the entire span of the New Kingdom. But before Thutmose III came fully into his own power, Egypt was ruled for roughly 2 decades by one of its most fascinating and unusual monarchs, a woman named Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut began her involvement in royal affairs as queen consort to her husband, and then, following his death, as regent for her young stepson, the boy who would eventually become Thutmose III. But rather than stepping back once her stepson came of age, Hatshepsut instead assumed the full formal role and titles of pharaoh herself, ruling Egypt in her own right for approximately 2 decades. An extraordinary development within a political and religious system built almost entirely around the assumption that the king's role, tied as it was to the god Horus and to a long unbroken line of male succession, belonged naturally to a man. Egyptian art and inscription from Hatshepsut's reign reveal a fascinating negotiation between the reality of a female ruler and the deeply entrenched conventions of Egyptian kingship. Statues and reliefs from her reign sometimes depict her in the traditional regalia of a male pharaoh, including the ceremonial false beard worn by kings during formal rituals, while other surviving images depict her with clearly feminine features and dress, suggesting that Hatshepsut and her court navigated this unprecedented situation carefully, blending traditional royal symbolism with an acknowledgement of her actual identity, rather than attempting to simply erase or hide it. Her reign is remembered today not primarily for military conquest, but for prosperity, monumental building, and, in particular, a famous trading expedition she commissioned to a distant land the Egyptians called Punt, likely located somewhere along the coast of what is now Somalia, Eritrea, or Ethiopia, though its precise location remains debated among historians. This expedition, recorded in extraordinarily detailed relief carvings at her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, brought back incense trees, exotic animals, gold, ebony, and ivory, and the carvings documenting it include remarkably vivid depictions of Puntite dwellings, the local ruler and his wife, and the loading of Egyptian ships for the long return voyage, offering us one of the richest surviving visual records of ancient international trade and cross-cultural contact anywhere in the ancient world. After Hatshepsut's death, her stepson Thutmose III assumed full unshared power and embarked on the military campaigns that would make him one of Egypt's most celebrated warrior kings. Interestingly, later in his reign, and more extensively under his successors, many of Hatshepsut's monuments and inscriptions were defaced or had her image and name removed, replaced in some cases with the names of male predecessors, an act of historical erasure that puzzled early modern Egyptologists, but which most historians today interpret less as personal vengeance and more as an attempt, later in the dynasty, to smooth over the theological irregularity her reign represented, restoring, at least on stone, the appearance of an unbroken line of male succession, even though the woman herself had, for 2 decades, ruled Egypt with genuine skill, confidence, and lasting achievement. If Hatshepsut represents one of the new kingdom's most quietly remarkable rulers, the pharaoh who ruled roughly a century later represents perhaps its most genuinely startling. His name, at birth, was Amenhotep, the 4th pharaoh to bear that name, and for the early years of his reign he ruled in ways broadly consistent with long-established Egyptian tradition. Then, within the first several years of his kingship, he initiated what modern historians often describe as one of the most dramatic religious transformations in the ancient world, a sweeping reform that abandoned Egypt's vast, ancient pantheon of gods, including Amun, the powerful state god of Thebes, whose priesthood had grown enormously wealthy and politically influential over preceding generations, in favor of exclusive devotion to a single solar deity called the Aten, represented not as a figure with a human or animal body, as nearly every other Egyptian god had traditionally been depicted, but as the literal visible disk of the sun itself, its rays extending downward and ending in small hands, some of them offering the Ankh, the symbol of life, directly to the royal family below. To mark this transformation, the king changed his own name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning roughly effective for the Aten, and relocated Egypt's capital entirely, abandoning the traditional religious centers of Thebes and Memphis in favor of an entirely new city built from nothing on a stretch of previously uninhabited desert land, a city he called Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, and which archaeologists today know as Amarna. The religious and artistic changes accompanying this shift were genuinely dramatic. Traditional Egyptian art, which had followed remarkably consistent conventions for nearly 2,000 years. Figures shown in a particular formal, idealized combination of frontal and profile views, proportions calculated according to careful, standardized grids, gave way during Akhenaten's reign to a striking new style, sometimes more naturalistic, sometimes strangely elongated and exaggerated, depicting the royal family with unusually stylized features, and remarkably for Egyptian royal art, showing genuine intimacy and affection. The king and his celebrated wife, Nefertiti, depicted playing with their young daughters, kissing them, holding them on their laps, images of tenderness almost entirely without precedent in the formal distance conventions of earlier royal Egyptian art. One of the most valuable and unexpectedly intimate sources of evidence from this period comes from a cache of clay tablets discovered at Amarna itself in the late 19th century. Inscribed not in Egyptian hieroglyphics but in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the wider ancient Near East at the time. These tablets, now known as the Amarna letters, preserve genuine correspondence between the Egyptian royal court and the rulers of other major Bronze Age powers, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites among them, along with letters from vassal rulers in the Levant, Egypt's client territories along the eastern Mediterranean coast, reporting local troubles, requesting military assistance, and sometimes pleading, with evident and increasing desperation, for the Egyptian court's attention amid regional conflicts and threats that Akhenaten, absorbed in his religious transformation at his new capital, may have addressed with less consistent diplomatic and military engagement than his predecessors had shown. These letters give us an unusually direct, unfiltered window into the actual mechanics of Bronze Age international relations, marriage alliances between royal families, exchanges of gold for horses and lapis lazuli, complaints about the quality or quantity of gifts sent between courts and the ordinary, human friction of diplomacy conducted across enormous distances, long before any modern means of rapid communication existed to smooth its inevitable delays and misunderstandings. Historians continue to debate Akhenaten's true motivations. Some see primarily sincere religious conviction, a genuine theological innovation moving Egyptian religion toward a form of monotheism, or something close to it, centuries before similar developments would emerge elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Others emphasize the political dimension, noting that Akhenaten's reforms conveniently stripped power and wealth from the enormously influential priesthood of Amun at Thebes, concentrating religious and economic authority instead directly in the hands of the king and his new capital. Most likely, as is so often the case in history, both religious conviction and political calculation played some role, intertwined in ways we can no longer fully separate from this historical distance. Whatever its causes, Akhenaten's revolution did not survive him. Within a few years of his death, Egypt began reversing his reforms, abandoning the city of Akhenaten, restoring the traditional gods, and in the process, largely erasing Akhenaten's own memory from official king lists composed by later generations, who remembered him, when they remembered him at all, as a heretic to be quietly written out of history rather than honoured as a predecessor. The task of this restoration fell, in its earliest stages, to a child. Akhenaten was succeeded, after a brief and uncertain transitional period, by a boy roughly 9 years old, believed by most current scholarship, based on genetic and archaeological evidence, to have been Akhenaten's own son. This boy began his reign under the name Tutankhamun, still honouring the Aten, but within a few years of taking the throne, his name was changed to Tutankhamun, honouring instead the restored god Amun, a small but telling detail marking the reversal of his father's religious revolution, likely guided, given his young age, by the powerful advisors and officials surrounding him. Tutankhamun's actual reign was, by the standards of Egypt's greatest kings, unremarkable in terms of military achievement or monumental construction, cut short by his death at around 18 or 19 years of age, the precise cause still debated among researchers, with theories ranging from a chariot accident and subsequent infection to complications arising from health issues potentially linked to the close intermarriage common within the New Kingdom royal family, a practice pursued deliberately in an effort to maintain the perceived purity and divine legitimacy of the royal bloodline. Though modern genetic analysis of royal mummies suggests this practice likely carried real and serious costs for the health of the children born from such unions. What secured Tutankhamun's extraordinary fame in the modern world had almost nothing to do with the achievements of his actual reign, and everything to do with an accident of preservation. Unlike the tombs of Egypt's most powerful and celebrated pharaohs, which were discovered by tomb robbers in antiquity, and thoroughly, sometimes almost completely, emptied of their treasures within a few generations or centuries of their original burial, Tutankhamun's comparatively modest tomb, tucked into a low, easily overlooked corner of the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, escaped serious plundering, likely because later construction work in the valley inadvertently buried its entrance under debris, hiding it from view for more than 3,000 years. When a British archaeologist named Howard Carter, funded by his patron Lord Carnarvon, finally located and opened the tomb in November of 1922, after years of painstaking search, what he found was unlike anything previously uncovered from ancient Egypt. A burial chamber and adjoining rooms, still packed with the original, largely undisturbed funerary furnishings of a New Kingdom pharaoh. Golden shrines nested one within another surrounding the sarcophagus, the now iconic golden burial mask, chariots, furniture, weapons, clothing, food offerings, and thousands of smaller objects, offering, all at once, an unprecedented, richly detailed window into the material world, the craftsmanship, and the religious beliefs of New Kingdom Egyptian royalty. By Tutankhamun's era, Egyptian kings had long since abandoned the Great Pyramid as a form of royal burial, a shift that had actually begun many centuries earlier, during the New Kingdom's opening years, when it became increasingly clear that a towering stone pyramid, however magnificent, was also an unmistakable advertisement to potential thieves of exactly where a fortune in gold and precious goods lay buried, close enough to the surface to be reached with sufficient determination and time. In its place, New Kingdom pharaohs adopted a strategy of concealment rather than monumentality, cutting their tombs deep into the rock of a secluded, easily guarded valley on the west bank of the Nile opposite Thebes, a place we know today as the Valley of the Kings. its entrances carved directly into the cliffs, and wherever possible, disguised or hidden from casual view, while the grand, publicly visible temples where the king's memory would be ritually honoured were built separately, at some distance, along the river's edge, deliberately separating the visible monument of remembrance from the hidden and hopefully protected location of the actual burial itself. This strategy proved only partially successful. Ancient Egyptian records, including surviving court documents from the trials of accused tomb robbers, make clear that theft from royal tombs was a persistent, ongoing problem throughout the New Kingdom and beyond, sometimes involving the very officials and workers entrusted with guarding or maintaining the tombs in the first place, driven by the same enormous gap between the value of the buried treasure and the ordinary economic hardships facing much of the population that has motivated grave robbery in nearly every wealthy civilization throughout history. By the end of the New Kingdom, the situation had grown severe enough that Egyptian priests undertook a remarkable, quietly moving rescue operation of their own, gathering the disturbed and replundered mummies of numerous New Kingdom pharaohs, including several of Egypt's most powerful and celebrated kings, and reburying them together, stripped of the golden treasures long since stolen, in two secret, consolidated hiding places where they lay undisturbed, protected by nothing more than secrecy itself, until their rediscovery by archaeologists in the late 19th century, more than 3,000 years after their original burial. It is a gentle irony worth sitting with quietly for a moment before we move on, that a king remembered by his own contemporaries as relatively minor, a boy who reigned briefly and achieved little of lasting political consequence, would become, through nothing more than the accident of an undisturbed tomb, the single most famous pharaoh in the modern popular imagination, his golden face recognized today by people who could not name a single one of the far more powerful and consequential kings who reigned before and after him. Egypt's New Kingdom reached what many historians consider its final great peak under a pharaoh who ruled for an extraordinarily long 66 years, longer than almost any other monarch in ancient Egyptian history, and who understood, perhaps better than any ruler before him, the power of monumental construction to project authority across both space and time. His name was Ramesses II, and his reign, beginning around 1279 BCE, is remembered for a combination of ambitious military campaigning, especially against the powerful Hittite Empire to the north, and an almost unmatched program of construction and self-commemoration, including the addition of new halls and colossal statues at the great temple complex of Karnak, the construction of a new capital city in the eastern delta, and perhaps most famously, the great rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in the far south of Egypt, their entrance guarded by 4 colossal seated statues of the king himself, each standing more than 60 feet tall, carved directly from the living sandstone cliff face, positioned with such careful astronomical precision that twice each year, on dates believed to correspond to the king's birthday and coronation, the rising sun's light penetrates deep into the temple's inner sanctuary, illuminating statues of the gods and of the king himself seated among them. Ramesses fought one of the best documented battles of the ancient world at a place called Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, a conflict whose actual outcome remains debated by historians. Egyptian inscriptions describe a triumphant personal rescue of the Egyptian army by Ramesses himself after a near-disastrous ambush, while surviving Hittite records suggest a rather more inconclusive result. What followed the battle years later was in some ways more historically significant than the battle itself. A peace treaty concluded between Ramesses and the Hittite king, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions, representing the earliest known international peace treaty in world history, whose text survives in reasonably complete form from both parties involved, a genuinely remarkable document establishing mutual non-aggression, an alliance against common enemies, and provisions for the extradition of fugitives, evidence that even amid the grandeur and self-glorification of Ramesses's monumental inscriptions, ancient Egyptian statecraft was also capable of careful, pragmatic, lasting diplomacy. By the time of Ramesses's death, Egypt had reached what would prove to be, in retrospect, close to the final high water mark of its ancient power and territorial reach. The centuries that followed his long reign would bring gradually increasing difficulty, economic strain, weakening central authority, growing challenges from groups collectively remembered Egyptian and other ancient Near Eastern records as the Sea Peoples, whose movements and raids across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE contributed to the collapse of several major Bronze Age civilizations and placed serious pressure on Egypt's own borders and resources, even as Egypt itself, unlike some of its neighbors, managed to avoid complete collapse during this turbulent period. What followed across the next 1,000 years of Egyptian history was a story of gradual, uneven decline, punctuated by periods of genuine revival, foreign conquest, and eventually, the slow folding of ancient Egyptian civilization into the wider currents of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Egypt fractured again into a third intermediate period, during which, markably, kings from Nubia to the south, ruling what is sometimes called the Kingdom of Kush, eventually conquered and ruled over Egypt itself for several generations, presenting themselves, with evident sincerity, as restorers of proper, traditional Egyptian religious practice and royal custom, even as they were, by origin, a distinctly Nubian dynasty, a reminder that the flow of culture, power, and legitimacy along the Nile Valley moved in more than one direction across the centuries, and that Nubian and Egyptian civilization, so often treated as separate stories, were in truth deeply, continuously intertwined. Later still, Egypt fell under Assyrian influence, then briefly reasserted independence under native rulers based in the delta city of Sais, a period sometimes called the Site Renaissance, during which Egyptian art and religious practice deliberately looked backward, drawing inspiration from the styles and conventions of the Old and Middle Kingdoms in a conscious effort to reconnect with the deepest roots of Egyptian tradition, even as the wider political world surrounding Egypt grew increasingly dominated by powers Egypt could no longer fully control. In 525 BCE, Egypt was conquered by the Persian Empire, becoming a province within the vast Achaemenid realm, ruled from a Persian capital thousands of miles away, a genuine and jarring rupture in the pattern of Egyptian self-rule that had persisted, with interruptions, for nearly 3,000 years. Persian rule was interrupted by periods of renewed Egyptian independence and reconquered more than once, until, in 332 BCE, a new conqueror arrived from an entirely different direction, changing the trajectory of Egyptian history permanently. His name was Alexander, a young king from Macedon in Greece, who arrived in Egypt not as a destroyer but, by most surviving accounts, as something closer to a welcomed liberator, freeing the country from Persian control, being crowned pharaoh according to traditional Egyptian custom, and founding, along Egypt's Mediterranean coast, a new city that would bear his name for the rest of history, Alexandria. Following Alexander's early death, one of his most trusted generals, a man named Ptolemy, took control of Egypt and founded a new ruling dynasty, Greek in origin and culture, yet one that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, while carefully, deliberately presenting itself, at least in its official religious and royal imagery, as the direct continuation of Egypt's ancient pharaonic tradition, building temples in the old Egyptian architectural style, adopting Egyptian religious titles, and, in most respects that mattered to Egyptian religious and administrative custom, ruling as pharaohs in full traditional style, even while speaking Greek at court and looking, culturally, toward the wider Hellenistic Mediterranean world for much of their broader political and intellectual life. The very last ruler of this Ptolemaic dynasty, and, in the fullest traditional sense, the very last pharaoh to sit upon the throne of ancient Egypt, was a woman named Cleopatra, the 7th Egyptian queen to bear that name, though the only one remembered vividly across the intervening centuries, thanks to her entanglement with the political fortunes of Rome, first through her relationship with Julius Caesar, and later, more famously and more consequentially, through her alliance with the Roman general Mark Antony. Their combined forces were eventually defeated by Antony's Roman rival, Octavian, at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, and in the aftermath of that defeat, both Antony and Cleopatra died by their own hand rather than face capture and humiliation in Rome, bringing to a close, in 30 BCE, the very last independent Egyptian dynasty, and with it, in the fullest political sense, more than 3,000 years of pharaonic rule along the Nile. Egypt became, from that point forward, a province of the Roman Empire, its temples still standing, its ancient gods still worshipped for some centuries longer, by a population that did not simply abandon its beliefs the moment its political independence ended, but its era of pharaohs, of god-kings maintaining Maat through their own divine presence upon the throne, had at last come to its quiet historical close. It is worth pausing gently at the very end of this long journey to consider the strange, almost dreamlike quality of the timeline we have just walked through together. When Cleopatra stood at the edge of the Mediterranean, gazing out from the harbour of Alexandria, the Great Pyramid at Giza was already more ancient to her than the Roman Colosseum, or the signing of any modern nation's founding documents, is to us today. She lived closer in time to the moon landing than to the construction of Khufu's monument. The Egypt she ruled had already, by her own era, spent centuries looking backward with a kind of nostalgic reverence toward its own deep, half-legendary past, restoring old temples, copying old inscriptions, honouring gods whose worship already stretched back, even then, further than living memory could reach. This is perhaps the single most humbling thing to sit with, as we let this long story finally settle into stillness. Ancient Egypt was never one single unchanging civilization frozen in time, the way it can sometimes appear in a museum hall or a single dramatic image of gold and stone. It was an ocean of change unfolding across 3,000 years, filled with revolutions and restorations, golden ages and quiet collapses, kings remembered as gods and kings deliberately erased from memory, farmers grinding grain in mudbrick courtyards, through centuries of dynasties, rising and falling above them, largely unaffected, in the deepest patterns of their daily lives, by whichever distant ruler happened to sit upon the throne in a given generation. And through all of it, underneath all of it, the river kept its rhythm. It rose in summer and fell in autumn. It carried black silt down from distant highlands no Egyptian farmer would ever personally see, and laid that silt gently across fields that had already been farmed. By that point, for longer than any single human civilization anywhere else on Earth had yet endured, boats moved north with the current and south with the wind, exactly as they always had, exactly as Egyptian hieroglyphs had described since the very earliest written records. Children played sonnet by lamplight, bread rose in clay ovens, small household gods watched over sleeping infants, protecting them from harm in a world where danger was always close, and comfort had to be actively, patiently built, generation after generation, by hands that left behind, in the end, some of the most extraordinary monuments and some of the gentlest, most human writing that the ancient world has ever given us. The pyramids still stand at Giza tonight, exactly as they have stood for more than 4,000 years, catching whatever light the moon offers them, watching over a river that continues, even now, to flow quietly north toward a sea that has seen empires rise from these banks, and empires fade back into the same patient, fertile silt that first made them possible. Let that be enough for now. Let the river carry the rest of the story gently downstream, into stillness, into rest, into sleep.